Good evening and welcome to the People's Platform. Our topic tonight is the price of rights during an economic crisis. Before introducing our guest on tonight's show, I'd like to read out a quote from Bertolt Brecht, who said, "The worst illiterate is the political illiterate. He hears nothing, sees nothing, takes no part in political life. He doesn't seem to know that the cost of living, the price of beans, of flour, of rent, of medicines, all depend on political decisions. He even prides himself on his political ignorance, sticks out his chest and says he hates politics. He doesn't know, the imbecile, that from his political non-participation comes the prostitute, the abandoned child, the robber, and, worst of all, corrupt officials, the lackeys of exploitative multinational corporations." So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest on tonight's show, Swastika Arulingam, attorney at law. Good evening and welcome, Swastika. Swastika, my first question to you is, we've seen how island-wide protests and the Aragalaya movement have really ensured the convergence of people who used to work with individualism and political apathy almost, now converging, aware of their rights, thirsty for information and wanting accountability for the actions and inactions of politicians, also called collective action. Speak to us about the line between collective action and human rights insurance.
I think your quote kind of sums up what's happening with the Aragali and what's happening in our country also. For a very long time, there were groups of people in this country, like if you take farmers, if you take fishers, workers, they have constantly been engaging in collective action, protests, peaceful protests, to get across a message to politicians, to elected representatives and so on. But I think by and large the middle class have been staying out of that political collective action, because I think relatively our lives have been better off compared to various other sections of the community or society. But with the crisis, with the economic crisis, I think that lid was taken off, and you see a resurgence of middle class protesters and people coming onto the streets, protesting not only in Golface but in various other places, in fuel lines, on the streets. And I think it's a moment in our history where the larger society becomes politicized, just like your quote was saying. We no longer accept, the middle class no longer accepts that it's okay, whatever happens, we go on with our lives. Whatever happens, we are only concerned about going to work and earning money and coming. We want to question the accountability, we want to question our politicians and so on. So connecting that to human rights have always been seen as something which is inherently ours, something which is very individualistic and so on. But the point which I want to raise through collective actions and so on is that human rights is best protected when people come together. When people stand together, when people call in unison for a certain political demand. Just to give a very simple example is that recently you would have heard about several arbitrary arrests which are happening, particularly of people who have been leading the Golface protests and so on. But unlike in the previous times, I would say police, the Sri Lankan police have been quite cautious and in fact very to some extent nervous of the public because of the change in political thinking and the change in the political movement in our country, in the way they handle arrests. Of course they still carry out arbitrary arrests, of course they still assault people, but you almost see an immediate reaction from the people when it comes. You see people converging outside or gathering outside the police stations, protesting and calling to release innocent people and so on. So I would say that is how this collective action and human rights come together. If you want to protect human rights, you need to come together to put your political demands in a collective way. And I think in terms of the middle class, that's what the Aragali has done.
Okay. Great. So let's also talk about a sector of society that has been badly hit by, firstly, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now due to the economic and political crisis, the free trade zone workers, and you work very closely with FTZ workers. Speak to us about the current challenges that they face in the wake of all of what is happening, and what kind of solution-oriented measures must we take, must the state take, must other corporates take, for example, as stakeholders in ensuring that our garment workers are protected and in ensuring that our garment industry is also protected?
Yeah. So I work with the free trade zone workers in my capacity as a unionist. I'm a member of the Commercial Industrial Workers Union. And there are several other unions also who work in the free trade zones. And the issue with the free trade zone, the workforce in the free trade zone is, I would say, that their wages are very low. And of course, the work is very precarious, because increasingly you see companies preferring manpower workers to permanent workers. Manpower workers are contract workers, which means that they don't have a permanent employment in a company. And the problem with having precarious work or manpower work at this time of crisis is that today you will have a job, tomorrow you might not have a job, day after tomorrow you will have a job. So you are constantly living in a state of uncertainty. And imagine a time when food is already, the prices are skyrocketing. You don't know you don't know what price of fuel will be tomorrow. So imagine a situation like now where you don't know whether you're going to get a wage tomorrow or not. So that section, particularly in the free trade zone, the sector called the manpower workers are particularly affected, and that is also a structural issue. This is not something which came today with the crisis. It has existed for a very long time. Unions have been articulating and demanding the need to make work and to make employment more stable, so that people can actually build a future from the wages they are earning. But because you touched on the COVID-19 pandemic also, I just want to mention that even while all of us were in lockdown and we were safely at home and so on, free trade zone workers were considered to be essential workers. So they were still, while all of us were in lockdown, they were still in factories and they were working and they were earning dollars for the country. So that is something which we have to be very, very conscious of, that our country's economy has always been held together by three categories of workers: plantation workers, the free trade zone workers, and the migrant workers. So any economic policy which comes through have to keep those categories of workers in mind, have to keep those categories of workers in terms of their wages. Their wages are very, very poor. So we have to keep their wages in mind and also empower them. Now, how do we empower them? We have various ways of empowering them. We can empower them in terms of giving them a few handouts here and there and so on. But something which free trade zone workers have been demanding for a very long time is the right to come together, just like the Aragaliyat, to come together in unions, to form unions, to sit together as equals in front of the management and bargain. There is something called collective bargaining, and bargain for certain working conditions, certain levels of wages, certain benefits, certain holidays and so on. And the right to unionize, which is a constitutional right, the fundamental rights, have been denied to free trade zone workers by various practices of corporates, by the complicity of the state. It has been denied to free trade zone workers since the inception of the free trade zone. So that with the crisis, with the economic crisis, I think despite the repercussions of joining a union, when you join a union in the free trade zone, the first thing which happens to you is you get fired from your job. So despite the very severe repercussions, workers are now coming out and putting their demands forward and saying, we want to join unions because that is the only way we can protect our collective rights as workers. That's the only way we can demand for reasonable wages and so on. So that is something which workers are doing right now. And I think that is something which we as the rest of the society also can learn from. Despite the severe consequence of joining a union, workers are still coming together to form unions, to have a certain level of dignity in the work they do and in the workplaces and so on.
Absolutely. Since you spoke about complicity, we see instances where corporates, we see instances where the state at times turns a blind eye when they stand to benefit from oppressing certain groups of society, such as the garment industry free trade zone workers. Right? So they need to be called out then in a larger, more pronounced manner.
Yes.
Let's also speak about the two other sectors of society that you spoke of, migrant workers. Swastika, we saw how a government decision was made to lower the age of migrant workers to 21. But correspondingly, we need to have processes and programs in place where they are trained about their rights, on self-defense. How many women go to the Middle East and come back battered, bruised, raped, with children in coffins, with nails in their bodies, and nothing is being done. It just becomes sensationalized when one or two women come back. But largely, we fail to talk about the societal issues, mainly because, and I hate to say this, probably because the middle class isn't affected by some Kusumavati from some remote part of Sri Lanka going through that, right?
So the reduction of age limits, that's a really good question which you raised, because we were having a discussion amongst unions about this also, whether we have a right to protest, because we were really concerned about the age 21. I mean, it sounds as if 21 is an adult, people should have the right to decide and so on, but 21 is actually a young person. It's a very, very young person who have no exposure to the outside world, and they are completely sent to a country which might or might not have protection for migrant workers. But the fact remains also that you can't, when a young person wants to go abroad and work, we also should not stand in the way and say and block that. But one of the things we as the state, or we can demand from the state, is one of the problems which migrant workers, particularly migrant workers going to the Middle Eastern countries have, is that they constantly speak to us about the lack of support which the state gives in those countries. So you remember during the COVID-19 pandemic, migrant workers were stuck without food to eat,
of course.
Unable to return, and these are people whom our economy has relied on. And now also we are asking them to send remittance back, and yet we fail to protect them. They were stranded there without food, without water, and it was the larger society which was demanding for their return. So if the government is planning to reduce age, if they are saying, okay, it is a right of a person to go to work and so on, we should not, in my opinion, we can't really question that. But absolutely. One of the things we can definitely question is, before you reduce the age, before you talk about the agency of workers and you reduce the age, you have a duty to ensure that you have a structure to protect these very young people who are going to Middle Eastern countries, who are also going to other countries. If the state cannot provide protection for workers who are going abroad, and if they end up stranded there and they have no recourse to any kind of means of protection from our own state, from our own government, from us, then I think the state does not have a right to say, I'm going to reduce the age because it's an agency of the worker and so on, because that is not the agency. That is, you're putting people in a very, very vulnerable position where their lives are at risk, where their health is at risk, where their security is at risk. And as you said, we have heard of Rizana, who's I think her name was Rizana,
Nafis,
she was beheaded, and we were unable to do anything. So who is responsible for that life? So this is something which we have to talk about, and we have to pressure the state. It's not so much about the age, but what is the kind of protection we are giving people who are going abroad, sending remittance, so that our country can stay afloat in this crisis.
Absolutely, and I want to also get your thoughts on these procedures, protection mechanisms that we can put in place now, and we need to also pressure the government, like you said, to put in structures so that we can enhance their knowledge of their rights. And then where the government, the Sri Lanka Foreign Employment Bureau, has processes where they can bilaterally also demand for a more enhanced protection for our workers.
I think there was an effort by the government to have a bilateral kind of agreement if my memory recalls correctly, but somehow it fell through the cracks and did not work out. But one of the things which our government can do is to demand for communication and connection with all the workers who are going abroad. And we cannot say we don't have enough human resource to do that, because we are sending these people who have never stepped out of the country, to a completely unknown place, to a completely unknown place where they speak an unknown language to work there. So at least we need to demand connectivity back at home, where they are able to speak to their families at least once a week. If they fall into trouble, they need to be able to come to a place where the government takes an undertaking that we will follow up on our workers who are abroad. We will keep sending messages back to the family, so the family knows what's happening and so on. Right now that doesn't happen. So as you said, yes, there has to be awareness about rights. There has to be certain kind of training. I don't think the training which is being provided to migrant workers is adequate to protect their rights and so on. But more than that, the government should take an extra step. It's not even an extra step. It's like the most basic thing the government can do to ensure connectivity. So when something happens, you don't have to wait for 50 nails to go into your hand in order for you to obtain assistance from the embassy, or for you to obtain assistance from our state.
I want to connect this with Sri Lanka being so well known for haphazard policy making.
Yes.
So randomly you wake up one day and you get an alert on your phone saying, you know, some crazy policy, and we don't know what else is happening. Yeah, it's like completely sort of dropped on you. How important is coherent, well-advised policy making in any matter?
I think any country and any state should have like it should know, like in 10 years time, where do we want to go. And Sri Lanka has never had that. We have moved towards more liberalization. We have moved towards flexible labor laws. We have moved towards intensifying counter-terror measures and so on. And there has been various justifications for that. But I think, as you correctly said in that first quote, I think the reason why we did not have a trajectory or like a path is because people were, particularly the middle class, was to a large extent depoliticized, so they did not bother to actively engage. When I say political activism, it does not mean you go and cast a vote. It's that you have to actively engage in questioning politicians, in questioning your elected representatives, in holding people to account on a daily basis, like what's happening now. But that should not happen when everything is gone, when you're at the rock bottom and you're in a state of crisis. It should happen on a day-to-day basis so that we won't reach this rock bottom once again. So it is very important to have a pathway. It is very important to have a plan for the country. But who creates that plan? Who gives? How do we create a people's plan, and not just the plan of corporates, or not just the plan of few people in power? But how do we create a people's plan? And I think right now, this political moment is the best time, despite all of the catastrophe and crisis and the deaths which are happening. Now is the moment to create that people's plan. What do we want to see our country in the next 10 years? Because people have come out onto the streets, and I would think now is the best time.
Absolutely. Let's also speak a bit about this aspect of economic violence, along with the fact that a lot of people from the lower stratas of society, in terms of income generation, are struggling with a loss of jobs, as a result of which they have had to move towards precarious employment opportunities, or other illegal, unlawful activities due to desperation, due to having to feed their kids. We have seen a rise in the crime rates as well, Swastika. The Prime Minister has promised an interim budget in a month's time, in 2 months' time, which he calls a Sahana budget, through which there will be some relief measures taken. In addition, 3.3 million families will be provided with 5,000 rupees as a relief package for the next 6 months. But, I mean, is that going to be sufficient? It isn't. What else must we do in addition to all the measures that are being suggested and proposed by the chambers of commerce and other intellectuals, professionals? What must society, what must individuals do?
State has to focus a lot on food production. 5,000 rupees per month is happened during COVID also. That doesn't resolve anything. It does not take anyone out of poverty. And on top of everything, every other politicization which is going on with 5,000 rupees handouts. So that is not going to resolve any measure. It's not going to resolve the hardships which people are facing. So the state as a policy, it has to focus on food production. And when I say food production, it's not about the state coming and politicians coming and making jokes about homegrown gardens and so on. We have gone past the stage of homegrown garden. There has to be a state-driven policy of cultivation, which people are initiating on their own at various levels. But the state still has not. The state still has not gone to that drive yet. There has to be an absolute drive to create food production because we are going into a crisis. So that has to be a state-oriented policy. The other thing, of course, is, as I said, so many people are resorting because of unemployment. So many people are resorting to precarious work, and as you mentioned, crime rates are going up and so on. So the other thing is to ensure, and this is where the corporates come in. We have to protect jobs at all cost. There has been talks of people relocating because of the rise in cost of production and so on. But what I would say is, corporates have, like for a long period of time, they have made profits and they have invested in these profits. So corporates can survive this, particularly the big companies can survive this crisis, while the workers who have struggled with low wages for such a long time, particularly with the COVID as well, they won't be able to survive if they go into unemployment. So now is the time for particularly large corporations to step in and to stay in the country, to continue to generate employment, continue to give quality wages and decent jobs to ensure that we move forward as a country in this time of crisis. So that is something which the unions also have been articulating, particularly since the start of the COVID, but particularly during the crisis as well. So that is something which corporations and companies can do for this country. As individual people, I think people are doing a lot given the crisis. They have gone onto the streets demanding for protections, demanding for economic rights. As you said, there has been deaths caused because of this economic crisis, and people have been protesting. But one thing which I think which can be thought about through this Aragale and through this people's struggles is to creation of policies. And that will take some time, because this is the first time we have seen something like that in our generation. So it will take some time. But people should come and articulate policies and put forward demands, very concrete demands. And one of the demands which they have put forward, which the government has consistently ignored, is the fact that they want the president to go home. But that has been ignored. But people have been consistently putting forward that demand. And that is something which I think our state, it does not matter who the president is, they want the current president to go home. So that is something which has to be heeded. So once that happens, I think people would get more and more confidence to put forward further demands, and I think we will see a change. So I don't, simply because we are in this crisis does not mean we are going to all just remain in this crisis and die. We have seen crisis after crisis in our country due to various reasons, war, tsunami, the COVID-19 pandemic, and now we have this economic crisis. I think we can get through this, but the state has to have a focus, corporates have to have a focus, which is not corporate-centric, but people-centric. And of course, we have the people.
All right, fantastic. We're going for a short commercial break. You're watching the People's Platform. We'll be right back.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
We must be prepared to face any challenge.
There is no quick fix, but we have to go for a solid fix.
Where do you think the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is heading right now?
Coming out of the ashes, like a phoenix, we will rise. People are fighting for daily survival.
We have to restructure our debt, there is no doubt about it.
I rather try at my best, sitting with the enemy, trying to sort this out.
IMF is not the destination.
We've heard lot of political parties over the years over-promising and under-delivering.
Face the Nation every Monday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1.
Welcome back. This is the People's Platform. We are in conversation with Attorney at Law Swastika Arulingam. Swastika, I always try to make sure that this program is, although is in the English language, doesn't just focus about on inflation and Columbo 7 centric topics. We also need to talk about those who are voiceless. In a bid to, again, create collective action towards better ensuring rights protection. Let's speak about this recent incident where a mother threw her child into a river. The child's body was subsequently found, and the mother was then arrested. What we ignore in this whole process of penal sanction is how there is so much of systemic injustice where we immediately penalize the wrongdoer in the eyes of the law, and that is so. But how many layers of truth and injustice are encompassed within all of that? Speak to us about that aspect. I mean, that is just one incident in 100, in 1,000, in 10,000s of such incidents which we don't see, which aren't reported.
I want to talk about two issues connected to that. One is about the role of criminal law or the penal sanctions, as you said, in a situation where the government and the state has abdicated its responsibility towards its citizens and has brought a country to its knees. So that's one thing which I want to talk about. And the other thing, of course, is this desperation which people are in and where that comes from. So on this first thing, as lawyers would, like, as we know, the state, we come together, as citizens, we come together to create the state in order to protect our lives and to ensure that we can basically life, liberty and property, right? That's the essence of a liberal state. So criminal law and penal sanctions also comes in that context, that if a state is properly functioning, then there is a belief that when something goes wrong, when someone kills someone, then the state will also be in a position to punish that person, and then we are all protected. Of course, there are arguments about it. I have my own disagreements and so on. But we are at a point when the state has abdicated, as I said, towards its citizens. We are at ground zero, at rock bottom. And you find people dying in fuel queues. You find a mother who has thrown a child, killed a child, and she attempts to commit suicide as well. And now what the state will come is pick up the mother, and they would prosecute her for the death of a child. And then the same thing, when it happened, when there was a counter violence during May 9th, now the state is picking up people and prosecuting them for the violence which erupted due to the anger which people have inside them because of the political instability. And the position, even as a lawyer, the position I want to take is that state and the courts can no longer look at crimes, can no longer look at people coming out to the streets and protesting. Even people pushing down police barricades, it can no longer be looked at a mere crime framed under the penal code in a very black and white sense, because that would be injustice. Simply to frame it, that would be injustice. The reason I say that is, for a state to reasonably prosecute and punish a person, the state should be doing its duty. The state should be providing food. The state should be ensuring certain basic welfare of people. When the state has failed to do that, when people are dying of starvation, when people are dying of standing in fuel queues, the state can no longer come and say, you can't throw your baby into the river and you can't kill yourself. I mean, what do you want the mother to do? Die of starvation? The child will die of starvation. So then my question is, you can, of course, the state will still go ahead and prosecute the mother. The state will still go ahead and prosecute people who were violent during the May 9th incident. But I'm not sure whether justice would be achieved through that. I don't think there would be justice. We would see justice through a system which is penalizing and sanctioning people who are acting out of desperation, which has happened because the state and corrupted politicians and elected representatives have not done basic duties. And without the state holding them to account, without the state holding the president and the prime minister and people who have been responsible for this crisis to account, I don't think it is justice to hold people who are acting in desperation to account. So that is on one side. On the other side, when you were talking about the mother attempting her suicide, I also remember the issue of microfinance and how women have been tortured, literally tortured by microfinance companies to pay back the loans which they have obtained from these women through various means. I mean, people say, okay, if you take a loan, you should pay back the loan. But you speak to people who have been working with microfinance women, these are not just loans which you gave because the woman asked for the loan. You go into the village, you hand out the loan, you say you can pay it back in 1,000 rupees per month and so on, and then you charge an interest which the woman knows nothing of, which a woman knows nothing of. And then you charge an interest and an interest and an interest. And then you drive her to desperation. And people have been driven to suicide because of these microfinance issues. And when you speak of the legislation, the laws revolving around microfinance and microfinance loans and so on, there is nothing in the legislation which will prevent people from predatory lending. There is nothing preventing, there is no legislation protecting women who are being driven to suicide because of predatory lending. And once you pass a law which is not in favor of people who need microfinance in the parliament, then the courts also simply have to implement the law. Of course, I would argue that the courts can take a natural justice position. Should a court implement a law which is driving people to suicide? Where is the natural justice in that? Of course, we can argue all of that. But this is another thing which I want to connect to the role of the state. What happens when you pass laws which are going to affect the most vulnerable in our society, which is going to affect women who are already in poverty? So these are also things which we need to talk about when we speak about suicide and we talk about death and when we speak about crimes and why people resort to these things when the state does not do its responsibility.
Beautifully put, Swastika. During the last 5 to 7 minutes, I'd like to get your thoughts on how justice is gendered, ethnicized, and there's a classist element to it. I want to relate the incident of the recent incident where MP Hirunika Premachandra, she embraced a policewoman and nothing happened to her. Whereas, and I saw on Twitter, someone had said, look, if I had tried to do that as a male from a minority, I would have got beaten up. So this ethnicized and gendered aspect of justice, especially because we spoke about arbitrary arrests. Yeah, your thoughts on it?
I'm hoping that the person who commented on Twitter was a man who wants to hug a male police officer, not a female police officer. Then that would take a different
Sure.
in a society which is extremely patriarchal.
Yeah.
But justice is gendered. Justice is not race blind. Justice is not class blind. So that's very true. Particularly when you practice in courts, all of this comes out. To give a very, very concrete few examples, is that when you go and do domestic violence cases in courts, the law is very strong. This is one of the few laws in our country which is actually which actually protects particularly women. Even though domestic violence does affect man and woman, it particularly protects women from very abusive situations. But when you're a lawyer doing domestic violence cases, you hear so many kind of comments from various people. Oh, men also can be. We are not saying men can't be victims of violence, but why does that question come in when you take up cases on behalf of women? So you find so many stereotypical views expressed about you simply because you're doing a domestic violence case. the talk of or the framing of abuse. Like when a woman who is abused at home goes to the police station, what does the police say? They say, oh, the husband beats. No, I mean, that's normal. No, that's part of family life. So then they send her back until she's beaten up again, and then she goes and back and forth.
So but if
exactly. Yeah. But let's say the woman stays in a marriage for 10-15 years, and because this is how the police react, she does not make a single complaint, and one day she decides to run away from the home and she decides to obtain the refuge of the court. Then people would ask, oh, why did she run away after 10 years? Why didn't she complain all of this while? So it's in a gendered aspect in terms of justice, it's almost as if you can never win. If you don't complain, then they'll ask why you didn't complain. If you complain, then they'll ask why you're complaining. Same with race. If you take the courts in the south, I'm a Tamil speaking person, so I'm a lawyer, right? But the court proceedings and everything happens in Sinhala. So I struggle to sometimes understand what's happening in court proceedings and so on. So imagine a Tamil litigant who comes into court. So they say, yes, we provide translations and so on and so forth. But that is not enough. Imagine a criminal trial where you have to prove you're innocent, and the entire proceeding happens in Sinhala, and only your evidence there is translation for evidence and so on. So you don't really know what's happening. Same thing with cases of the Prevention of Terrorism Act, cases which comes under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. During the Civil War and even afterwards, there were so many people who were Tamil speaking who were prosecuted in courts which were functioning in Sinhala, and they would not know what's happening. So then you find the race dimension coming into justice, and of course the class dimension. If you're a poor person, then you don't have, particularly in criminal cases, you don't have legal aid as of right in the magistrate's court, and then you're pitted against another person, you're pitted against the entire state, which has the defense mechanism to prove their case, and you don't have a lawyer as of right because you don't have the money to hire the lawyer, and so on. So it has various aspects. Justice, law in our country, it's not race blind, it's not class blind, it's not gender blind. So as lawyers, I think we don't think about it. We have been taught in law college that the law is neutral and objective, but the law is never neutral and objective. It always takes a side, and it's usually the side of the powerful. So we have to always be conscious of that when we present our case in court.
Absolutely, and I think the citizenry also needs to be aware. Like if we have an aware citizenry that is aware of their rights, their duties, their responsibilities, I think it would be quite difficult to hoodwink them.
Exactly. Yes. I go back to the quote of what you quoted. I don't know the person who said it, but political awareness is very important. That is the only way in which you can transform a state. You need to be politically active. You need to question as a collective, not as an individual. Swastika going and questioning someone is not going to change anything.
Working in silos doesn't really help. You need to converge.
It has to be collective action. And we saw what something like the Aragalia can do. The country's prime minister resigned because that was a demand of the people. Of course, we didn't achieve anything, but something happened. And I think that is what collective actions can do, and that is how you protect human rights, through collective actions.
Absolutely. Beautiful conversation. Thank you so much, Swastika Arulingam, attorney at law, for joining us on tonight's edition of the People's Platform. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again on Monday with the Sinhala edition of the People's Platform. Have a safe weekend. Good night.